You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is the 23rd of January at the time of recording. You might be listening to this a day later or over the weekend. But welcome back. Happy to be talking football after a long, largely basketball-related set of podcasts, which, well, that's a team that's certainly in an interesting spot right now. Can't wait to talk more about them this weekend. But we're going to talk football today, and we have Taylor Lehman from Bison joining us once again. Taylor, this was such a regular part of both of our lives for the whole fall, and then it was just gone for a while. And it's great to have you back. It's great to be talking football again, and I'm looking forward to hopefully doing this more regularly throughout the spring.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it was nice to kind of take a break for a bit. That was a hefty season, but yeah, no, I've been working on these like radar charts for previews for men's basketball games, and I posted a couple of them on social media, and someone replied and said, "I liked you better when you were talking about football," and I was like, "Fair enough." So I'm also glad to be back talking about football.
I don't think that's a you problem. I'm just going to be honest. Like, I think that's problem. No. So it's a mess right now, but hopefully things straighten out for basketball, and we'll certainly have some more content on them coming up soon. We're going to talk football today. And before we dive into that, just a quick reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Home Field supplying IU football fans throughout the course of this last season with all kinds of new, cool stuff. I know the college football playoff didn't go the way that we all hoped that it would, but I hope everybody got a hoodie or a long sleeve tee or something to commemorate the fact that IU was in the college football playoff. First of many appearances, obviously. But you know, the first one is always worth commemorating. So if you haven't yet, go to Home Field Apparel, go to the IU section. I think they still have some stuff left from the playoff run. So go grab that. Use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. And I just saw today that Home Field's bringing the mystery boxes back. So if you want to dive into a new school and you don't want to know who it is, you want someone else to pick it for you, Connor and the folks over there will send you a box with some new stuff. So check that out. Go to homefieldapparel.com, and we appreciate them being the presenting sponsor for Crimson Cast. Also, programming note, we're going to be live again at the Upstairs Pub coming up on Saturday, February 8th. We've got our normal Back Home Network reunion show and event. We're doing the podcast pretty much completely self-contained within Upstairs. I will be over there probably around an hour before that Michigan game gets started. Indiana hosting the Michigan Wolverines. It's going to be a big game regardless of what happens in these next couple of games. We'll have some folks from Assembly Call that'll be down, and hopefully some folks from elsewhere in the network joining as well. Hopefully you folks can join us. Again, that's going to be Saturday, February 8th. Would love to have you there. So head on over to the Upstairs Pub. We'll have more info on this show. We'll have more info on the Twitter feed and things like that. If you're still using Twitter, I know a lot of people stopped in the last couple of days for reasons. And but there'll be ways to get that info. The best way to do it is just listen to the Back Home Network. Either listening to us here on Crimson Cast or listening to Assembly Call or some of the other shows that are on the network. So we're looking forward to seeing you all out there, and hopefully you're able to join us. Taylor, let's dive in. First of all, before we get started, we had a ton of IU questions, and I just wanted to lead off by telling everybody we're not going to get to all of the football questions you asked today. We're going to kind of split this up. We want to take advantage of Taylor's expertise with the roster, with the transfer portal, with what's going on elsewhere in college football. So we're going to answer a lot of those questions today. And then Scott and I will tackle some of the other questions about seeding and some of the other stuff that's come up here lately. So just wanted to set expectations. But before we dive into the questions, Taylor, I guess the first thing I have for you, we just had the college football season end on Monday. Ohio State defeating Notre Dame. Closer game than I think I expected it to be. And yet it was pretty clear Ohio State was the superior team from a roster perspective. I'm guessing you weren't surprised at all that Ohio State won the national title, but looking at the playoff as a whole, like, did you have any overarching thoughts, or were there any elements that did surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, overall, Notre Dame's performance kind of surprised me. After watching them make the run and kind of proving against tough opponents that they were a worthy team. It's not a surprise in the end. But I remember you and I talking about how this was an interesting statistical setup based off of the schedules of both of these teams, Indiana and Notre Dame, and how we would have to see where they kind of meet in the middle. And unfortunately, it ended up being closer to the Notre Dame side of things than Indiana. But I think that was quite a surprise. But honestly, I remember telling you, Galen, when the bracket was released, that the national champion was going to be the winner of Ohio State and Oregon, and it was. And I guess the surprise for me was just like how poorly Oregon played against Ohio State.
Yeah,
I think that's a testament to Ohio State's coaching staff. But overall, honestly, I like the college football playoff. The debate around it and all of that kind of put a damper on some things, but also it kind of added to it in a lot of other ways as well. So. I thought both teams were deserving of being in the playoff. I didn't think anybody was missed. I think there's still some SEC folks that think Alabama could have made it to the championship, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I thought the playoff was pretty good.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And obviously I think Notre Dame winning the games they did was impressive from them. I think if I had another surprise, it was I think probably how well Texas played in the semifinal. And this is like you at the before, and I supported you in this. I thought you were right. I didn't think Notre Dame was that good based upon what we saw on paper. And then they played, I think, significantly above that. And, certainly there were numbers there where you could have looked at them and said, well, Notre Dame is clearly a much better team people are giving them credit for. But I think there was enough room statistically to question whether they were. And they proved the doubters, us included, wrong. Texas was kind of the same way. And Texas, they lacked the high-end resume wins. Their offense was a little bit stodgy. The best games that they won were either like Michigan, when Michigan was clearly not whole, or the A&M game towards the end of the year. And A&M was clearly not that great of a team either. But I was really impressed with how they played in the semifinal. So that was the big one. But I'm with you. Like, it was a really, really entertaining set of games. There was a lot of drama, and the fact that, as much as we talked about the hosts, and talked about the buys and talked about the extra game and talked about how like Oregon got screwed or Ohio State got screwed. It's like it all worked out just fine. And the teams that were good ended up rising to the top, and that's really how it should be. So I'm curious to see what tweaks they make to it. But for all the people who said this wasn't a good idea, I think it turned out to be a pretty good idea. And, the folks like me who had been advocating for a playoff expansion for a while, I think kind of got vindicated by the way the whole thing played out.
Yeah, I thought also another thing I want to mention was I thought the whole playoff was kind of a win for Tom Allen. I thought he performed really well, his Penn State's defense, which was cool to see, honestly. And then him making the jump to Clemson, all of the last year for Tom Allen, I think has been really cool to see. But then I thought the greatest advantage in the playoff were those hosts being able to host in their actual stadiums. And then we saw that play out, in the way that they played against the teams with the buys. Not that bye weeks are bad or anything, but I just thought that playing at home versus playing at a neutral site, regardless of location of the neutral site, is a huge advantage.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I also think from the standpoint of the buys, a lot of it really was like it illustrated something that I don't think has been played up quite as much as it should have been, which is that winning your conference championship was as much a product of the schedule you played in some cases, or who you didn't play with the schedule, as it was anything else. And this is why the expanded playoff's a good thing. And I'm not trying to be critical of like an Oregon, because they played Ohio State, during the regular season, but you think about the fact that Ohio State lost a couple of games and still was allowed to go participate in the college football playoff and have a chance at winning the national title. Like, Ohio State is, with 2 losses and not being in their own conference championship game, doesn't get a chance to compete, and now they're the national champion. And much as we see in the NFL, and this was a point we were trying to make in October and November, no one remembers who the top seed was after the Super Bowl's over. You know, like who was the top seed in the NFC and the top seed in the AFC like 5 years ago? Nobody remembers that. What they remember is who won the Super Bowl. And I think we've got to get out of this mindset that, and it's like kind of ironic for an IU fan to say now, you know, since a lot of the argument for IU was, well, they only lost one game in the regular season. But you know, I do think within reason, like don't be Alabama and go lose like 3 games against subpar competition and then just expect to be granted an entry. But there's a medium there, and that's where the numbers come in. It's where, you know, knowing from an analytics perspective that yes, Ohio State, despite losing those 2 games, is really good. You know, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So that was kind of the other thing I took out of that equation, and I think that overall it sets the table for this upcoming year, which segues us into Indiana and where Indiana is going to be. Like, so Indiana comes off of this historic season, 11 wins, most in school history by far. And it's funny watching the reaction to Indiana, both in terms of the final poll, which I know you had a little bit of a qualm with in terms of where Indiana lands. They land at 10th. Yeah. And then some of the look ahead polls that we're seeing, you know, and we've seen Indiana. I think I've seen Indiana ranked as high as like 17th or 18th. I've seen Indiana not ranked. Most of the polls that I've seen have got Indiana kind of in the 20, 21, 22 range, somewhere in that vicinity. So this is good progress for Indiana. As we know, like getting ranked in general does not happen for Indiana, let alone being ranked in the preseason. And we saw how important that was in terms of the perception of IU in relation to other teams that started the season ranked. But as you look at this IU roster, now that we more or less know who isn't leaving, who's still going to be on the roster, there's still some pieces that are likely to be added. But how do you feel IU's roster has transitioned through the portal period and the end of the college football season as they get ready for spring?
The first word that comes to my mind, because I've asked myself this question too, Galen. The first word that comes to my mind when I think about it is just stability. You know, that there's not a wave of departing transfers leaving, which is so unusual within the open portal era for Indiana. Just given where the program was when it kind of opened up, it kind of in 2021, you know, it was rough there for Indiana, you know, and it kind of got people thinking that this is just what the portal does. It takes away from a team like Indiana, but that doesn't have to be the case. And so I think that's what we're kind of seeing. There aren't a ton of guys leaving. And then as far as like additions, I think they're raising the floor of the talent on the roster, which is, you know, kind of all you can ask for at this point. I think the ceiling of talent, like, you know, I think the ceiling could be higher. Maybe they'll add something along the offensive line, but you know, even, and I've talked about that before, like adding really effective offensive linemen through the portal can be really difficult. But yeah, I think, you know, I think like you were saying, Galen, I think somewhere between 20 and 22 seems pretty fair for losing a Curtis Rourke and you know, and some of the guys on defense. Like I think that's fair.
Yeah. I think you hit some really key points. So if you look at what IU lost in the portal, 11 players transferred out, and only 3 of those players have landed with new teams. One of those guys that transferred out was Taven Jackson, who was just not going to be a competitor for the starting role here. And, you know, he landed at UCF. You know, Donovan McCulley ended up landing at Michigan, which, you know, good for him. We'll see how that goes. And then Najee Logan ends up at Nevada. None of the other players have landed anywhere. So, you know, you're not talking, and that doesn't mean they won't, but it's not a group that was clearly in particularly high demand. And those are the players that you kind of want to transfer out. If you've played the college football playoff game, you know, you wonder how much of that was the encouraged transfer page that you hit on the roster as you're going through the various elements of the dynasty. You look at what Indiana added, and they took care of some key positions. And this was a part of a lot of the questions that we had, you know, revolved really around this particular aspect of things. You know, the whole idea of like, what did Indiana get in the transfer portal? What did we think about the acquisitions? So, maybe let's dive in there to start with. What transfers in were you most impressed by, and who do you think will have the most impact? Let's take Fernando Mendoza first, and let's put it aside, because clearly he comes in as the starting quarterback. We've already seen a couple of lists where he's listed as maybe the best quarterback in the Big Ten by some folks. So let's put him aside and talk about him first. How important was that transfer, in your opinion, for IU? And let's start there, and then how you think he's going to be used, because we had a couple of questions on that I'll read.
Yeah, I think it really brought up a lot of things about where this program is going and where the staff is going to carry over the success. I think he represented a lot when it came to that. I thought, the quarterback's coach is the only departing coach off of this staff, and adding Chandler Whitmer, and then, I don't know if Chandler Whitmer, I doubt Chandler Whitmer had a lot of conversations with Fernando Mendoza, but telling Fernando Mendoza this is the guy we're bringing in had to be part of the conversation. He's not going to commit here without a quarterback's coach. So I think that's a big win for Indiana in terms of Chandler Whitmer, but also because of Fernando Mendoza. And I think it also shows that there's just a blueprint for success here. Like they can lay out for this extremely coveted quarterback transfer. They can lay out what their offense is going to look like, how it's going to fit for him, and also just their path forward for, molding this offense to the roster that they have. And I just thought that showed a lot of great things there, but then also just Fernando Mendoza's talent on top of it, coming from Cal. And I released a BSB on him earlier, but I think that I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Caleb, but I just think that the addition of him just represents a lot of positive things.
So, I mean, you already answered this somewhat in the BSB issue, which I recommend everybody go to read. But can you summarize? Patrick Feltz asks, how does Fernando Mendoza change Indiana's offense compared to Curtis Rourke? Pro Ball Hoosiers had a question from his 13-year-old son, Calvin. Do you think Cignetti will want to use Mendoza like he used Rourke, or will he use his legs more? So that's kind of a combo of questions there. How do you feel like the acquisition of Mendoza changes IU's offense, and how would you expect this staff will most likely use him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he has more mobility, especially after Curtis Rourke had his ACL issue,
Who knew?
I think right. So he has more mobility. He had a 50-yard rush this past season. His running back Jaden Ott for some reason had a huge dip in performance this year. That a lot of Cal he had an injury that he was dealing with for a majority of the year. So that meant that the plays that were being made had to be made by Fernando Mendoza, and so he has the threat to run. But he's still, when you compare him to other quarterbacks as far as rushing attempts, it's still, pretty low. The PFF has sacks removed rushing attempts, and he had 52, which is not very high. It's an average of about 5 a game. And compared to other quarterbacks, that's a pretty small number. And he didn't grade particularly impressively either as far as running the ball. But the threat is definitely there more than it was with Curtis Rourke. So and then when you compare the way the offenses are ran, Cal ran a ton of RPO, which fits Indiana's offense. Cal ran more RPO than Indiana did. And so, and they also passed more often out of RPO, which is what Indiana was doing a lot last year. So I think it's going to be a lot closer to what Curtis Rourke did at Indiana in 2024 than people might think. So he can run RPO. He's a smart guy. He's really good under pressure. And also he's a dog. He's gonna run, and it might not be very often. It might not be like a Riley Leonard situation, but he can do it. The threat is there.
Looking at some of the other entrants here, transfer wise, there were some other standout names. Obviously, I mean, early on in the portal acquisition process, you had Jose Wheeler from Western Kentucky, who was pretty impressive in Conference USA as a defensive tackle, one of 2 interior defensive linemen they pick up. They also get Dominic Ratcliffe out of Texas State. You get a couple of offensive line transfers. Zen Mikowski, who's an Indiana native, who was at Ohio State. That's nice. That's a talented player who was interested in Indiana originally before Ohio State came calling. And you get a previous Hoosier in Khalil Benson who's coming back after having transferred to Colorado. The lines were clearly of importance. And if you look at Indiana and where things fell apart last year, offensive line was just not able to sustain against really, really high caliber defensive lines, as we saw against Ohio State and Notre Dame. Defensive line did sustain. And I mean, what you got out of CJ West and what you got out of Carpenter, and I mean, that whole group was just really, really impressive. So, obviously there's a little bit more work to do there, but how do you feel about what Indiana's gotten in the transfer portal so far on both lines?
Yeah, I think the offensive line still needs I mean, I think they both still need some work, but the offensive line, right now, the way that it's kind of playing out, I kind of expect Bray Lynch to move to center. That's kind of where he was before he needed to be a guard this year. I expect him to move to center, and then with Khalil Benson at right guard and Zim Mikulski at right tackle, and then Carter Smith obviously at left tackle. Left guard is still a question to me. I don't know if they want to run it back with Drew Evans, or even if they could. I don't know if he's going to be recovered by the season, and he's definitely not going to be able to develop this offseason. So I would like to see them still, approach interior offensive linemen. The only issue is that at this point they can't come in for spring camp. So unless they can pull some like major strings and get them in. So, I mean, I think they've done well as far as I can't
pull strings, by the way, folks. I just wanted to note, I don't have that power in
yeah, come on, Galen.
I get some power.
Yeah. You can't sneak him in the journalism program in one of these media school programs.
I have no comment on that, actually, Taylor. So
I thought taking Zim Mikulski from Ohio State was actually really an encouraging sign, because I don't think they were necessarily expecting him. I don't think they were nudging him out. I think they wanted him in the program and thought that he could develop into somewhat of an effective offensive tackle in the Big Ten. So I thought that was really effective. Bringing back Khalil Benson, I'm actually kind of excited about him. I think he's coming into the best offensive lineman and offensive line environment that he's had in his career. So I think that's encouraging. But then defensively, I really do like the two additions on the interior, and Mikal Kamara coming back is really great. I would like to see him kind of produce more against some higher level teams. But at the same time, on the other side of the defensive line, they really need to address the stud defensive end position. Because I'm not really sure, honestly, who's going to be there right now. I'm sure they have some thoughts on it, but yeah, I don't know.
We did have a question from Father Kavanaugh. Any chance of IU pursuing further offensive linemen? Two offensive linemen from Notre Dame entered the portal today. Mm-hmm. Do you see Indiana potentially being a landing spot for either of them, or is that a bit of too pie in the sky?
I mean, I think they could. I think, I don't know if they were necessarily expecting those guys to enter the portal either. And with Indiana not bringing anybody else in, it kind of, you can kind of like connect some dots here. But it'd be cool. I guess. I think,
especially Coogan is the center. I mean, that would mean Bray Lynch doesn't have to move to center. Which reshuffles the entire deck there and certainly makes it a little bit easier, especially with the uncertainty with injuries elsewhere. So, I mean, who knows? That just happened 4 or 6 hours before we started recording this, so nobody knows at this point. But that would be interesting to see if that were to occur.
I think I think it could too.
Yeah.
Sorry, Galen, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. Let's. I mean, looking at the rest of the portal additions, it's spread nicely throughout the roster. They pick up a backup quarterback in Grant Wilson, which they needed, not just with Taven Jackson leaving, but also the news that Tyler Cherry is going to be out for an extended period of time with injury. So all you've got is the younger Mendoza brother essentially on the bench, and now you've got at least somebody who's been battle tested in Grant Wilson who can come in and back up Mendoza. You get a couple of wide receivers. I'm really intrigued by Tyler Morris from Michigan. It's an interesting trade that like IU gets Tyler Morris, who was clearly a threat in the kick return game and had some really nice catches at various times. And Michigan gets Donovan McCulley, who struggled to stay on the field. I'm really fascinated to see how their pathways end up going next year. And then you've also got Mekhi Jackson from Appalachian State, which just seems like one of those classic Signetti group transfers. It's like as soon as I saw that guy was out there, I was like, that guy's almost certainly going to be an IU player.
Yeah, it's interesting, Galen, that the UC, so Tino Sinceri at UCLA took App State's quarterback and their other receiver. So the two leading receivers and the quarterback from App State are now playing for the former James Madison guys. But yeah, no, that's I think Mekhi Jackson is interesting. I think he brings a lot of versatility, similarly to like a Miles Cross, where he played with Elijah Surratt at St. Francis, and yeah, I think he played slot there, and he actually outperformed or outgained Elijah Surratt on that team. So, but then he went to App State and he played on the perimeter. And so, being 6'1", I think he can really kind of play anywhere on the field. Tyler Morris split his snaps half and half between slot and perimeter, and I think Tyler Morris is somebody I'm really excited about. I don't know if people know like how highly recruited, highly recruited he was. He was like 133 in the country in his class, and Indiana doesn't really sign guys like that. So again, that's like a ceiling. That's like a talent ceiling addition.
Right.
And he does a lot of the dirty work. So I think he's a great blocker. He can play anywhere on the field. I think he's going to kind of be unleashed this year. I'm pretty eager to see that. I think he's more of the starting slot receiver versus Mekhi Jackson, who is probably going to kind of split between the two.
And then, you look at some of the other items. They picked up some fairly impressive, skill position players. You look at, we mentioned obviously Morris and Mekhi Jackson. You've got Riley Nowakowski from Wisconsin, a tight end, which I think that's a nice addition. They needed a tight end there. The two running backs, Roman Henby from Maryland and Lee Beebe Jr. from UAB. So it feels like, they restocked in those positions, and they certainly needed to restock at running back because, the guys who had been the most productive were gone. I feel pretty good about where they're at with a lot of those roles, especially when you consider that they kept Omar Cooper Jr., they kept Elijah Surratt. They've got those guys back, and they've got this new group coming in. That was the ideal scenario for IU, was that they were going to be able to add to the talent pool while keeping their best players if they were still going to be eligible.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially a tight end like Zach Horton. He was great. He did a lot of the fundamental stuff. He was a football guy, but he had hit his developmental ceiling. We got the Zach Horton that Zach Horton was going to give us. so there's Riley Nowakowski, like you were talking about, from Wisconsin. He's a great blocking tight end, probably not going to be super involved in the passing game. But then Holden, I think his last name is Stace. I think that's how you pronounce it. Holden Stace,
right,
from Tennessee. And he was at Notre Dame, and some of the tape that I've seen on him is really impressive for his size. So he can line up in slot too. I think we're going to see a lot more 12 formation, like 12 personnel formations with two tight ends and a running back. And that's something that this offensive staff has ran before. So I think that's going to be some way that the offense changes, is a lot more two tight end personnel sets, especially since they do have like versatile receivers. They don't have as many receivers, I would say, to get on the field. And we haven't seen the exiting or the departing transfers during the spring yet, I suppose, but this is kind of lining up to me to have a lot of multiplicity, both in the passing game and in the running attack, with Roman Henby and Lee Beebe, and then two tight ends and a running quarterback as well.
So you think they're going to do like 22 personnel? I mean, are you looking for like a more of a, or are you thinking more single back, two tight end, two wide receiver sets?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, single back, two tight ends, two wide receivers. Yeah. Yep.
Interesting. Yeah, that's certainly a different look.
So yeah. Yeah, and with an RPO, it's really helpful too, because you have two tight ends, and then you can have some blocking receivers, and that can be super helpful as far as like developing creases and defenses.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch this play out overall, because it's I mean, I think, Indiana, they ran a lot of, what is that, 11 personnel? Is it one running back, one tight end, and then 3 wide receivers last year? But they've got the versatility to do what they need to do this upcoming year in terms of how they want to try to set things up. Because they could even go 2 running backs, 2 tight ends. They've got more versatility, perhaps, in how they're deciding to run things. I am really curious to see what wrinkles they end up doing and whether Mendoza's running ability makes them more or less likely to go into sets with 3 or 4 wide receivers, because clearly with Rourke, they wanted to give him as many targets as possible, knowing that he wasn't going to be particularly mobile. At least that's kind of what I came to believe as the season went along.
Yeah, absolutely. And Roman Himby, I mean, Roman is somebody we haven't really talked about, but he's super impressed. That addition is super impressive. I think he has NFL talent as a running back. He can be involved in the passing game as well, which is really helpful. But I think, a lot of folks think that he's going to be like a bell cow running back. But honestly, when you look at the numbers of like rushing attempts, he hasn't really been. He maxed out at 188 at Maryland. He averages about 155 a season, and that's fewer than Tyson Lawton had this past season. So there's definitely room there for Lee Beebe to fit in. And when you talk about having 2 running backs like that, that's kind of insane. Honestly, that's a wealth of talent.
Defensively, in the transfer portal, we mentioned the defensive tackles they brought in. Lewis Moore back again from Ole Miss, transfers in at safety. You've got Marion Knighton from at cornerback, Rylan Gandy, also a cornerback out of Northern Illinois and Pitt, respectively. It's, the defense retained a lot of guys. Aiden Fisher's back. You mentioned Mikhail Kamara's back. They kept some really good guys, and it was, I guess, pleasantly surprising when Kamara decided to come back. So maybe like talking about those additions, but just talking generally about where you feel like the defense is at right now. Do you feel like the defense is going to be able to stand pat with what they've done, or like where do you feel like everything arranges in terms of where their personnel currently sit in your eyes?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that Elijah Hardy played well when he was on the field. He's going to be, I have him slotted as Jalen Walker's replacement, and they haven't added anybody at linebacker, so that's an interesting spot there. They must really have a lot of confidence in him. But when you talk about this defense, you got to talk about the defensive line. And I know we kind of already mentioned it, but not having somebody at stud defensive end is interesting. At least from what I can see, but they're not going to go into the season without somebody there that they're confident in, because they've invested a lot of money in those coaches, so they need to invest either money or effort into the defensive line as well. And so I kind of wrote in BSB recently that just the addition of Jose Wheeler is fantastic, and the reason why he was so coveted in the transfer portal as a defensive tackle is that he can play further away from the center of the line than a lot of other defensive tackles can. And that opens up so many things for what you can do. You could go, if you wanted to, you could have 5 defensive linemen out there with the way that he's able to play on, near the perimeter. And so, I think that just fits a lot of the defensive tackle talent that you have on this roster. Those guys, I think I saw a question, Galen, that I was tagged in a lot of the questions on social media. I think I saw a question that said, what are some of the strengths that are maintained on the roster? I think defensive tackle is one of them. And so, you don't have a CJ West necessarily. I think Tyreek Tucker is going to step in for him, which he was, solid, but he wasn't CJ West. So I think it's going to have a slightly different look than it did last year, but I think it can still be really effective. But I think as far as like defensive backs go, I'm not really sure where safety sits right now. You talked about adding Lewis Moore, and they also added Devon Boykin as well.
Yeah.
And so, they have like some anticipated starters. I'm not sure who's going to be where between Lewis Moore and Boykin as far as like Rover versus safety next to Amari Farrell, but returning Amari Farrell is fantastic. And, if there's going to be a young person seen on the field on defense, it's going to be at safety if they don't add somebody else. So that's the part of the defense that I'm most curious about. And something that I think, maybe wasn't tested that much in the Big Ten as often as I thought it might be this season. And I think they do rely a lot on the pressure from the defensive line to kind of influence that and kind of mask, some weaknesses that might be there. But I would like to. I am curious to see kind of how that shakes out in the defensive backfield, because the safeties were really important to what they did.
Yeah, the questions there kind of coming from Hoosier 98 and from Matt Park as far as like offensive line, defensive line, overall defense, and and it kind of revolves around a couple of questions we had, which fit together. Ali Sanzenbacher asking, what position group is your biggest concern on both sides of the ball, and Trent Perkins asking kind of a connected question, but like looking at the transfer haul last year versus this year. How do you feel IU did? Where did they make upgrades over what they saw last year? Keeping in mind, I don't know that anybody expected the transfer haul last year to turn out as well as it ended up turning out. I think we tend to forget that. I've heard so much about IU lost all these guys that were key contributors, and it's like no one really thought they'd be key contributors coming in. Like no one knew if that would actually work. Taking those questions kind of in tandem, what are your thoughts on last year versus this year, just in terms of transfer portal and where you think the roster sits right now?
Yeah, I think the transfer portal served two different purposes between last year and this year. I think last year it served, let's transplant our culture and our system from James Madison here at Indiana. And this year it's more about, okay, let's elevate the system and culture. So when you're adding talent like Holden Stace at tight end, or you're adding I'm drawing some blanks here, but Fernando Mendoza, Roman Hemby, the guys that we've been talking about, when you add them, that's great, because you have your system in place. You've seen how it can work in the Big Ten and how it can't work. You see now that it's in place, how do we expand it and how do we strengthen it? And I think that's kind of what they're doing here. And I think they've done a decent job with that. You can look at this and when you're really attached to some folks that kind of left, like a Jalen Walker or a CJ West or even a Curtis Rourke, a Justice Ellison, those are some locker room guys especially. So that'll be interesting to see. But also, it might seem like those guys are irreplaceable, and they might be, like Elijah Hardy might not be able to step right in for Jalen Walker. That's yet to be seen. But they are adding some talent at these positions. So I am kind of eager to see how this is taken to the next level within the Big Ten.
There's a lot of ways we could go from there. And I guess where I'd like to go, it's actually a question. I want to make sure I get the right person that asked the question, because, we've talked a lot about the portal, but, there was a lot of curiosity about, where are things at in terms of the recruiting class that Indiana brought in. It ended up being a 38th, I think, in the country. And it's kind of a different era now in that you can plug transfers in pretty quickly. You have to, but you're also bringing in freshmen. And actually this was from Antoine Randall L (B-ball player on X. So which freshman do you see having the best opportunity to see real playing time? Not necessarily the best freshman, but who has the best opportunity within their position? Is there anybody that sticks out to you particularly there?
Yeah, I think it's kind of both. I think Byron Baldwin has a real chance. He's a safety. And like I was just saying, the safety seems a little thin. So there seems like there's some opportunity. If he's Big Ten ready, I think, there's a chance that he gets into some sort of rotation if they want to do a rotation within the backfield. My guess is probably not, but I think that's probably the best shot. I think if we're also talking about redshirt freshmen, the defensive end position might be one that could possibly be a spot. I guess maybe if LeBron Bond comes in and they really like what he can do and he takes on the system pretty well, he could be the second or maybe third slot receiver and see the field. But yeah, as far as freshmen, those are the only ones that I can really see seeing the field in 25.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have. You want to be able to give those freshmen development. you want to be able to maybe slot them in for a game or two and not burn the red shirt, because you don't do that, at least under the current rules, until you've played more than 4 games in a season. And we're moving quickly towards an era where you're just going to get 5 years, I think, to play college football, with no red shirts. So we're a little ways away from that, but we'll see. And again, it is rare to see freshmen getting out there and playing regardless in college football at this level, just because of the physical maturation that your body has to go through. So much of it is just weight training and building up your stature so that you can compete out there with some really elite athletes, especially in the Big Ten. So yeah, I think you're on board. I mean, Baldwin is the gem of the class. He was the 1 4-star amongst a group of 3 stars. Was a guy that I think people were disappointed when he decommitted and then excited when he recommitted. So there would seem to be some positives there, and hopefully he can slide in and make some contributions. I guess maybe turning a little bit, we had a bunch of questions about the overall setup in terms of what Indiana's got, and Tom Shanklin asks, do you feel like this methodology that Cignetti and his staff have had about focusing on performance over potential and not going after a whole lot of 4 and 5-star guys and instead going after guys who had productivity, that worked last year, obviously, but a lot of that was because they were used to a lot of the players that they brought in already, having had them at James Madison. Do you see that being a stable and consistent pattern that will work? And, where do you think, at some point you do kind of hit a hard wall in terms of, gosh, we're going up against Ohio State, who's packed with 5 stars. Is there still a hard ceiling on Indiana, or did last year prove that you can scheme your way around those hard ceilings if you have the right kind of players?
Yeah, I think you do run into a wall. I think it's a great strategy going for production over potential, and a lot of folks have taken that on as the way to approach the transfer portal, but it's not. There's no single way to approach the transfer portal. The reason why Cignetti and his staff did that was because they were bringing their entire system. All they needed were experienced players that could take on and fit within that system and learn it quickly, because they needed to. And the way that they were able to teach that system and coach guys to it that quickly was really, really impressive. And so, then you get to a game like Notre Dame, and one of the first things that I noticed was when you got down to the red zone, Notre Dame's players just looked so much bigger than Indiana's, and we already knew Indiana was surrendering some size to the Big Ten this season. So eventually you have to get to the point where you are investing in those 4 and 5-star high school recruits. You can't, and I think that's where they want to get to. I think that's where Kersey Netty's already said he wants to build from the high school ranks. Right. And so if you want to be at this level, you're going to have to start landing those 4-star, maybe some 5-star recruits, and then develop those guys with the Derek Owings.
So going to that, Sam Tobin Hochstad asks, what are the things IU needs to do to recruit the top players, whether it's from high school or from the portal, compared to where they are now? Is it NIL? Is it on-field success? Is it truly just cult of personality coaching stuff? What do you see as the biggest barriers? And you and I have talked about this a bunch. We've talked about how you go to Ohio State, and historically, the way that you just walk in and it's a different feeling. It's a very professional feeling. That was not always the case here at Indiana. You're starting to see that change, and certainly Cignetti and their staff really approach things in a way that's more in line with what you do at an Alabama or an Ohio State. But there's a big leap from that to actually getting those players consistently. So what do you think Indiana has to do to be more in the realm there where they can pull those guys in?
Yeah, the first thing people always say when they talk about this is they need to improve their facilities. And I kind of have a hot take. I don't think the facilities are as far behind as folks think. The locker room is very nice, which is always a huge pull. John Mellencamp Pavilion could use some upgrades, but honestly, not as much as some folks think. I think of the Woody Hayes Center at Ohio State, and that it's not super impressive when you walk into it. I'll just say that. So it just looks like a football practice facility and a hangar essentially. And so I think what they need to do is NIL for sure. continuing to invest in that, and then continued success in the field. And I do think the cult of personality coaching thing is a real thing. I think the players like strength and signals of strength, and also competence, and but also I've been seeing some of the schools that they've been recruiting, and it's been pretty impressive. They have a kid from Massillon, Ohio, coming in for junior day, and that's, I mean, just having interest in anybody. I've been to like some like camps at Massillon at that high school there, and I've seen some Indiana assistants there, and there was definitely like a boxing out of certain programs, like MAC programs, and Indiana was kind of lumped in there with that. And so the fact that, you know, one of their best players has interest in Indiana is already an improvement on the recruiting trail. And there are many other schools that are like that as well. So, you know, recruiting the hotbeds, not recruiting scared, you know, and continuing to invest in NIL, continuing success in the field. And then, like you were saying, Galen, kind of exuding that culture of, you know, it's all football, you know, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, you said something there about, you know, not recruiting scared. I mean, it always was amazing when you look at the players that Indiana was in the final mix for. They'd be like one of 2 or 3 Big Ten teams, and the other 2 Big Ten teams were always like Purdue and Minnesota, or somebody along those lines. And it's no wonder that you feel like you're starting from behind. And even with that, you know, Indiana's been able to maintain a certain level of competitiveness. It's not that much of a leap. And I'll also remind people, though, that you can have a very successful program, as we've talked about many times on this show, without getting a ton of 4- and 5-star players. I mean, I always point to Wisconsin and Iowa as the 2 kind of lodestars of this idea, where both of those programs really got to the level that they got to through development, through excellent scouting, and through system. And it feels like this. I mean, you look at the success Indiana had in the portal with some lightly regarded guys this year. You know, some of them Cignetti and his crew already knew about, but the fact that they had them in the first place is an indicator that they see things in the recruitment process that not all coaching staffs do. And you know, the thing about the facilities is fascinating too. And I actually think that this applies to other sports, like maybe basketball, when you'll hear like, oh, it's impossible to win there because the facilities aren't good, or the arena's bad, or the fan base, you know, is bad and doesn't support the team. And then like a really good coach goes in and starts winning there. And you're like, wow, this guy's a miracle worker. And then he leaves, and then they're right back to where they were before. Like, so much of it comes down to, do the people know what they're doing? Because that is like, you can overcome average facilities. You can overcome a bunch of things if you just know what you're doing. It's hard to pick people who really know what they're doing. And a lot of people will use facilities or fan support or NIL. We hear NIL all the time. NIL is the reason why this guy got fired or this or that. And it's like, a lot of times it's just the coach isn't that good, but those are easy things to point to, but where it doesn't seem like it's your fault, it's actually somebody else's fault. So I do think that I know that got off a little bit from what Sam had originally asked, but I think everything you said absolutely fits into the bill of like, how do you attract more talent? But you can do a lot with talent that most people just view as like 3-star talent if you have a good developmental process and you know what to look for in the scouting cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, you know, recruiting the state as well. And I've said that a million times, but just recruiting your region, and Chris has already targeted that and talked about that as well. But yeah, Galen, I mean, yeah, if you continue hiring guys that kind of match your culture, and also, you know, they watch hours and hours of film together. They work on remaining fresh as a scheme and as a system, and that's why Kurt Cignetti is always watching film with them, and so Kurt Cignetti knows how to run a football program. And so it takes a lot of the emphasis off of the facilities, like you were saying, especially with the NIL era as well.
Yeah. A couple of other items, as we're not going to go forever tonight. A lot of people asking about Brian Haynes. Brian Haynes' name gets brought up. in relation to the Penn State defensive coordinator job after Tom Allen goes to Clemson. Notre Dame's defensive coordinator job just opened up because Al Golden has taken the Cincinnati Bengals defensive coordinator job. So Rob Rexing asked, is Haynes going to be the DC at Penn State? Uncle Old Crow asked, what are the chances Brian Haynes gets poached this year? Lee Butler asked, how vulnerable are Cignetti's staff? So we talked about Haynes specifically. And there's, I think it's worth pointing out how impactful Brian Haynes was for Indiana this year. You texted me this stat. Read this for the people, because I don't know if people fully realize exactly what a turnaround this was.
Yeah. So this is going to be in a bite-sized Bison coming up pretty soon. Just kind of looking at how the turnaround they made analytically in one season. And, I was looking at defensive EPA per play, essentially the quality of plays that you're surrendering to opponents. And Indiana was ranked 116th in the country, meaning in 2023. Meaning they were surrendering a lot of quality plays pretty often, and they jumped 97 spots in one season to 19th in the country this past season. That's unadjusted. Adjusted, I haven't been able to calculate that, but I know that Indiana is even more favorable in adjusted EPA per play defensively. So Brian Haynes, like that work that he and his staff did, and I think we also need to talk about like Buda Williams and Pat Kuntz in that as well, the defensive line coaches. And so, yeah, I think that's that work is huge. So yeah, losing Brian Haynes would definitely hurt. Replacing him would not be easy. Same with Mike Shanahan on the other side too.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, Haynes makes a lot of money. The equity bumps that the assistants got. He's one of the top paid defensive coordinators in the country now. It's a tremendous show of financial support by Scott Dolson and the athletic department. And so, as you pointed out in text, and I agree with you on this, like if Haynes does end up going, I don't think it's because of money. He might make a bit more at one of those two locations. And this is going to be an interesting test early. Like people were upset that Tino Sunseri left, but I don't know why. Because when you're a quarterback's coach and you're not the primary offensive coordinator, if a Big Ten school offers you the offensive coordinator job, you're going to take it. That's just that's what you do. That's how you advance your career. If you're a defensive coordinator for a team that was just in the playoff, is there an advantage to going to a Penn State or a Notre Dame? Maybe. And again, it comes down to one of those things where it's the unknown. I'm going to go take over a new defense, new personnel. There's going to be higher expectations, but not that much higher. It really will come down to, do I feel like one of those places is a better route to whatever I want to get to? And, most of the time, if you're a DC, you want to become a head coach or you want to become a DC in the NFL. Like there's some routes there. And the statistical performance is the statistical performance. Like he did miracles here with IU this year. This is about as hot as he's going to be as a coaching commodity. It will be very interesting to see what ends up happening. He's tweeting like he's not going anywhere, but you never know until these things actually happen.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about Brian Haynes staying. I think I was using Zach Osterman's reporting of his salary bump, and it looks like if you were to compare the salary increase that he had, or the salary he's going to be making in 25 to the 2024 assistant salaries, it's 12th, tied for 12th in the country amongst assistants, and it only increases. So if he stayed, until I believe it's like 2027, he'll be making $2 million a year, which is like a top 8 assistant salary in 2024. And so, like you were saying, it wouldn't really be a money thing, and unless whatever program he went to was like, yeah, we'll just throw a bunch of money at you. But also the reason why I'm optimistic, Galen, is because I don't know if you've watched some of the coordinator hires at some of these programs, but they're hiring really experienced guys like Jim Knowles, Al Golden, and I'm also thinking of like Chip Kelly at Ohio State as well. Yeah. And there's somebody else that's like slipping my brain right now, but the Wink Martindale at Michigan, and and so Brian Haynes, a lot of the hires that are being made aren't necessarily like, am I making my team better? It's more, should this make my team better? Because if you make a hire like a Wink Martindale and it doesn't work out, then you can just, get rid of Wink Martindale and the head coach is preserved. But if you make a hire like a Bryant Haynes, who he's still young, he's only been in the FBS for 1 season. He's only been a defensive coordinator for 2 seasons.
Bryant Haynes' senior year of college football was the last year of the George W. Bush administration. Like he hasn't been out of college that long, comparatively speaking. I mean, he's a relatively young guy. So your point is well taken. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, are they going to take the risk to hire a Bryant Haynes, even though he was a finalist for the Royals Award? It's still a risk in the eyes of a lot of fan bases and a lot of, athletic departments. That has me optimistic.
It is an interesting thing because it actually works in Indiana's favor because you could say, well, we need someone with more of a proven track record at the power conference level, which that's great for Indiana if that's how they want to do it. It's kind of how Indiana got Curt Cignetti in the first place and brought his staff, because the idea was, well, we're not going to hire this 61 or 62-year-old coach who's never coached at the FBS level before, and Indiana ended up being the beneficiary of that. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch how all that plays out. A couple other quick questions here before we get you out. What do you think? Michael Rayom asked this. What strengths of this season's team, the 2024 team, seem repeatable? What's going to be tougher to replicate? So like if there's the things that Indiana did well this past year, obviously they had a tremendous offense through, really up until Curtis Rourke hurt the thumb. And then, Purdue game aside, that fell apart a little bit. The defense got stronger. The defensive line really played like well above what we thought they would. So looking at what we know right now of the roster and looking at what you would expect with the coaching staff largely unchanged, where do you feel like Indiana can repeat things? Where do you feel like Indiana may have to find a new way of going about things? And to throw a question on the end of this from Jim IU 95, how much of a factor is it that there's now a full year of film of this coaching staff coaching in the Big Ten? Is that a problem, or is it just simply a matter of execution?
Yeah, no, I think that's a real, I think that's a concern for every team every year, like every coordinator. The more film that's out there on you, the more vulnerable you are. And I think that's something that, and like I was talking about earlier, like this is why Cignetti and his staff watch so much film together, because they want to stay fresh. And that's why Mike Shanahan's bag is so deep. Like I always say, like his passing concepts. Actually, there's a really interesting graphic that Bud Davis put up on Twitter that I'm going to include in a bite-sized Bison pretty soon.
It's a great graphic. I hope everybody it's amazing. It's a fascinating look at how the passing game works in college football.
Yeah, in Indiana, they obviously they had a lot of routes that they ran a lot in their passing attack, which is like post routes and fades. But in slants, and then they were kind of across the board, fairly average in the rest of the routes ran, which was different from the other teams around them, which meant that it was not a predictable passing attack. And I think a lot of that was just that Mike Shanahan formed the passing attacks at the quarterback and the receivers that he had. So something that he might have to change with, Curtis Rourke's, back shoulder pass not really necessarily being there anymore, unless Fernando Mendoza can do it, is he might have to go a little shorter. And that's something that we kind of saw as later in the season. They really locked up some of the receivers and prevented them from getting those like 10-yard routes, breaking out of those 10-yard routes. And so that's something that I think they might have to respond to, having shorter routes, maybe more of a screen game. And if you can get the RPO going, as far as like the rushing attack, like running out of those, I think that can be really helpful as well. But as far as like as far as defense goes, it's really kind of hard to tell right now. I think they could. They're always going to have the aggression on the defensive front, but can you ensure that you can stop passing attacks? Like they really did hold down Notre Dame's rushing attack in that game. Aside from the 98-yard run, but then it was the passing attack where Notre Dame was able to move the ball down the field a little bit more, and they kind of did that against Ohio State too. But like can those two things exist together? Can you be that aggressive on the defensive front and defend the pass well enough where you're not going to get gouged from certain teams like a Maryland, like they did last year, or even in Ohio State in certain situations? So I think those are some things that I'll be watching for as far as how it changes.
Yeah, it's really going to be interesting watching them kind of maneuver through not only the fact that there's film, as Jim pointed out, but I don't think you can underestimate how underestimated you can be as a football program the first year. It's hard to get in your mind, oh, Indiana's going to give us a game, or Indiana's going to be that hard to play against. That may be a little oversold sometimes in terms of how much it matters, but what isn't going to be oversold next year is how fired up people will be about beating a team that was in the college football playoff last season. And you think about, that's a scalp you want to put on your wall. If you're a player, if you're a coach, it's like, hey, we knocked off Indiana, who was in the college football playoff last year. And whereas, everybody does that with Ohio State, but Ohio State's so much better than everybody else that even though they get a lot of people's best shot, a lot of times it's not nearly enough and they get overwhelmed. But it does happen with like the Penn States and the Michigans, those teams that are kind of in not quite in that very top echelon of talent, but the teams that are, you can get on if everything goes wrong for you and everything goes wrong for them and everything goes right for you. Indiana just doesn't have the talent base. So that is going to make it. I think the biggest thing next year, the culture is so important because Indiana is no longer going to be the hunter. Even in the games they're playing, the only teams they're really looking up at that are on their schedule for this upcoming year are Oregon and Penn State. Everybody else finished below them in the conference standings that's on their schedule this upcoming year. That's going to be an adaptation, but that's where bringing in some of these players from Power 2 schools is going to be really important because they will at least know what that vibe feels like and what they need to address it, and they've seen their own teams probably do that in the past.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And, I think, I get it. I think bringing in a Fernando Mendoza too, that's already shown that type of leadership. And, I think that's huge. Roman Hemby understanding how to run against Big Ten defenses. That's big. Holden Stace, with his experience in the SEC and at Notre Dame. I think that, like you were saying, the transfers they're bringing in are huge, but also, the Big Ten experience that some of these guys already got, like an Aiden Fisher. I think that's huge. Just understanding, the competition and also something else too, the experience for the coordinators at the college football playoff level. I think that is also huge because I think we saw a lot of mistakes against like an Ohio State. Well, I mean, even just going to the silent count against Ohio State, that was a struggle. And so some of these coaches that haven't coached at this level, getting this experience is super helpful, and it helps in not just carrying over the culture from 2024, but reshaping the culture into something where you're going to be better prepared for some of those games like an Oregon or a Penn State next year.
A lot to talk about, a lot more to tackle. We had a ton more questions we didn't get to on this one, but we will get to them on the next show later on. Hopefully this weekend, we'll try to tackle that. Taylor, when's the next BSB coming out? Everybody wants to know.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit. Today's Wednesday, so like maybe the 24th, 25th, 26th, somewhere in there.
Yeah, today's Thursday, Taylor. I'm not sure if you've checked your calendar, but it is.
Oh my God. It is Thursday. Oh, I really
Friday.
did. I did that on air. Can we
got 4 hours? Yeah, nope. I do it all the time. You get to do it too. But no, if you haven't been to, go to bitesizebison.substack.com. Subscribe to Taylor's work. He's very gracious giving us like tidbits of the information he puts in his paid newsletter on here. So we appreciate that. But go over there if you want to follow along with IU throughout the spring. Spring ball's not that far away. And so there's a lot coming up that's worth keeping an eye on, and the stuff starts happening quick. We're like 230 days, I think, from the start of the season. Season football tickets are, the campaign started. We just got the emails on that yesterday. So a lot to get excited about, and it was great talking IU football with you again, Taylor. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, and I will say everything that I said on here, I've also included in Bite-Sized Bison. So if you liked what you heard, there's a lot more. I have I think I wrote 4,000 words on the winter portal period. So yeah, I know it's a little long. It's like reading a novel, but anyway, it's all over there. I'm also doing some men's basketball stuff as well. So
this is the inequity of broadcasting versus writing. You write a 4,000 word piece, everybody's like, oh my God, that's huge. I do an hour and a half long podcast. Everybody's like, will this guy please shut up? This is too long. So there's no consistency in any of these things, but it's fine. Anyway, Taylor Lehman from Bite-Sized Bison joining us here on Crimson Cast. We'll be back with more football and basketball coverage as we continue to talk about what's going on with IU athletics. So be sure to tune in. Be sure to catch us on the YouTube channel. Just search Back Home Network. And be sure to follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For Taylor, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.